Welcome to Season 3, Episode 15 of CSS Breakdown, Book by Book. This special episode offers a comprehensive summary of Michael Kimmel's The Gendered Society, a deep dive into how gender is socially constructed, institutionally enforced, and critically important to understanding power and equality in our world. So today, we're embarking on a really fascinating deep dive into Michael Kimmel's seminal work, The Gendered Society. Our mission here is to unpack the intricate ways gender operates in our lives. I mean, from our most intimate personal relationships right up to the broadest, most pervasive societal structures.
Right.
We really aim to equip you, our listener, with a truly nuanced understanding, highlighting some surprising facts and sparking new insights into a topic that, let's face it, affects us all every single day.
Absolutely. It's everywhere.
And our insights for this journey come directly from extensive excerpts of Kimmel's incredibly detailed analysis. He draws on such a rich tapestry of fields: anthropology, sociology, psychology, history.
It's very comprehensive.
It really is. So what does it truly mean to live in a gendered society? Let's unpack this together.
Okay, so, often when we think about gender, our minds just jump straight to biology, right?
Yeah.
Chromosomes, hormones, anatomy.
The usual suspects.
Exactly. But Kimmel's core argument, and this is really the critical foundation for everything else we'll discuss, is the idea of the social construction of gender. It's a powerful concept.
Mm-hmm.
And what anthropologists have revealed is, well, that gender means vastly different things to different people across cultures and historical periods. And we're not talking slight variations here.
No, these differences can be profound, almost mind-bending sometimes.
They really can.
It's truly remarkable how much our assumptions about what it means to be, say, masculine or feminine are shaped by where and when we live. We tend to assume these are universal traits, but, well, that's just not the case, is it?
Not at all.
Consider masculinity, for instance. Our own culture often encourages that kind of stoicism in men, the quiet strength, the stiff upper lip, that constant pressure to prove oneself.
Right, the strong, silent type.
Exactly. But then you look at other cultures, and you might find men far more preoccupied with demonstrating sexual prowess, sometimes to an extent that might surprise us here in the West.
Yeah, definitely different priorities.
And in others still, the definition of masculinity is far more relaxed, maybe rooted in civic participation, emotional responsiveness, even a collective provision for the community's needs. It's just not a one-size-fits-all ideal, which really challenges our default thinking.
And this incredible cultural variation isn't limited to men, of course. Some societies value women who are decisive, competitive, strong leaders, while others, well, they insist that women are inherently passive, maybe helpless, completely dependent. Think about it, what it meant to be a man or a woman in, say, 17th century France compared to, let's say, Aboriginal peoples in the Australian outback at the turn of the 21st century.
Wow, yeah. Huge difference.
The cultural definitions of gender are so immensely different that comparing them can be difficult, maybe even impossible. In fact, Kimmel points out something really striking. The differences between two different cultures regarding gender are often greater than the differences between the two genders within any single culture.
That's such a powerful idea.
It really is.
And that's such a crucial finding, isn't it? It really drives home the point. If the meanings and expectations of gender can vary so widely from one culture to the next, and even change within a single culture over time,
Which they do.
then our understanding of gender simply cannot rely solely on biology. It absolutely must draw upon the tools of the social sciences, the behavioral sciences, history.
Right, you need that broader lens.
It makes you pause and consider, what does this cross-cultural and historical variability mean for our own understanding of what it means to be a man or a woman today? It really opens up so many possibilities, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And, it leads us directly to another pivotal point Kimmel makes. This subtle but pervasive objective equals male equation. The sociologist Georg Simmel observed this, that man's position of power in society doesn't just ensure his superiority over women, it also, kind of subtly, ensures that his standards, his experiences, his norms become generalized. They become the generically human standards that are then expected to govern everyone's behavior, men and women alike.
So the male perspective becomes the default human perspective.
Exactly. It's a quiet assumption that just permeates everything.
And Kimmel highlights this isn't just some abstract philosophical point. It has enormous tangible consequences in nearly every arena of our lives.
Oh, definitely.
From the way elementary school classrooms are structured, to the subtle expectations in professional and graduate schools, and certainly in every workplace we step into. This dynamic is subtle, yeah, but profoundly powerful.
Because it sets the baseline for what's considered normal or human as implicitly male.
Right. And it leads to what Kimmel describes as a kind of hidden national debate about masculinity that's actually playing out right now, even if we're not always consciously aware of it.
Mm.
Like, for example, what gender comes to mind for you listening right now when you hear common American problems like teen violence, gang violence, suburban violence, maybe drug violence, or violence in the schools?
Yeah, it's usually male.
Overwhelmingly, right. Or how about when I say the words suicide bomber or terrorist hijacker? It's striking how deeply ingrained our gendered assumptions truly are in our collective consciousness.
It's a stark illustration, isn't it? Now, let's turn to a particularly fascinating and, let's be honest, often contentious area: challenging biological determinism.
Okay.
Kimmel argues that our society's relentless search for biological evidence to explain supposedly natural sex differences, and maybe more tellingly, to suggest that inequality somehow flows directly from those biological distinctions.
Yeah.
It reveals a profound cultural desire to believe in them.
We want them to be true.
It seems so.
Yeah.
Want these differences to be innate, almost desperately so, because it often serves to justify existing social arrangements and, well, power structures.
That's such a powerful observation. A prime example of this plays out in sociobiology, especially when it tries to explain reproductive strategies and sexual behavior.
Ah, yes, the sperm versus egg argument.
Exactly. The argument, which you hear all the time, goes something like this. Males produce billions of tiny, energetically cheap sperm, while females produce one gigantic, energetically expensive ovum.
Right.
Therefore, the theory posits, for males, reproductive success hinges on fertilizing a large number of eggs, which naturally leads to a propensity toward promiscuity.
Spread the seed, so to speak.
Pretty much. By contrast, females who invest far more energy in gestation and lactation, a much higher reproductive cost, are naturally more selective, more choosy, and tend to be monogamous, picking the male who will make the best long-term parent.
Mm-hmm. Journalists like Anthony Lane suggest women seek marriage to monopolize a man's resources for their children. And sociobiologists like Donald Simon speak of completely different sexual psychologies based on these biological imperatives.
But Kimmel provides a powerful and, frankly, necessary critique of this viewpoint, especially when these theories try to explain incredibly complex human behaviors like rape.
Yeah, that's where it gets really problematic.
The argument that rape is simply sex by other means for reproductively unsuccessful males, for instance, is just deeply flawed and quite dangerous.
Absolutely. Kimmel points out most rapists are not driven by lust or some biological urge for reproductive success. Instead, they're often interested in humiliation and violence, fueled by rage, a desire for power.
It's about power, not sex.
Often, yes. Many rapists, he notes, already have regular sex partners, even wives. Furthermore, victims are often well outside of reproductive age, either too young or too old.
Which doesn't fit the reproductive strategy model at all.
Not really. And critically, why would some rapists hurt or even murder their victims? That would prevent the survival of the very genetic material they're supposedly trying to pass on.
Good point. And what about homosexual rapists?
Exactly. These neat, tidy theories of selfish genes or evolutionary imperatives simply cannot adequately explain the nuanced and often brutal complexities of human behaviors like rape. It really forces us to ask, what happens? What crucial context gets missed when we try to reduce such profoundly complex human behavior to simple, convenient biological drives?
It's a critical, maybe even ethical, failing in those arguments. And the same pattern of finding what one expects to find, well, you can see it in historical brain research, too.
Oh, yes. Kimmel highlights how much of brain research throughout history seems to fit neatly into existing preconceived ideas about men's and women's roles.
It's almost like researchers were unconsciously, or maybe even consciously, looking for brain-based differences that would just happen to explain the behavioral differences they already observed or expected.
Right. You know, this next point about brain research really opened my eyes. It's almost unsettling how much science can reflect what we want to believe. Consider the science of craniology in the late 19th century. Scientists were actively trying to prove men's brains were superior. But get this, they couldn't even agree on which measures to use.
Seriously?
Yeah. If they used the ratio of brain surface to body surface, men's brains won. But if they used brain weight to body weight, women's brains appeared superior.
Wow. So it depended entirely on how you measured it.
Exactly. This ambiguity, this scientific confusion, meant they had to constantly search for more decisive methods to demonstrate male brain superiority. It really underscores how scientific inquiry can sometimes be shaped, maybe even distorted, by prevailing societal expectations rather than pure, objective truth.
That historical example is a really powerful reminder. And building on that, let's look at common stereotypes about mathematical and verbal ability.
Ah, the classic boys are good at math, girls are good at words.
Right, it's widely believed. However, psychologist Janet Hyde's extensive meta-analysis, reviewing a huge body of research, seriously challenges this.
What did she find?
Well, she looked at 165 studies of verbal ability, including over 1.4 million people, and found no gender differences whatsoever.
None. Wow.
None. And when she analyzed 100 studies of mathematical ability representing nearly 4 million students, she found only modest gender differences. And get this, females actually outperformed males in general studies, except among the very most precocious individuals, where the difference was slightly in favor of males.
So the stereotype is largely just that, a stereotype.
Pretty much. And the truly crucial finding here, the thing that almost every comprehensive study ever undertaken has consistently found, is that there is a far greater range of differences among males and among females than there is between them as groups.
Ah, the within-group variation versus between-group variation.
Exactly. The variance within groups, that is, the differences between one man and another man or one woman and another woman, far outweighs the average variance between the two groups, despite any possible slight differences in mean scores.
So what that really means is the differences among men are often greater than the average difference between men and women. And the same goes for women.
Right. So the old idea that men are one way and women are another, like two distinct uniform groups, the research just doesn't support it. We're all far more varied within our gender than the average difference between genders suggests.
It truly shatters that men are from Mars, women are from Venus's idea, doesn't it?
Completely. And it makes you wonder why we cling so tightly to those broad stereotypes about individual ability.
It certainly does. Now, the case of homosexuality offers another powerful illustration of gender as a social construct, rather than something that can be explained away by some simple biological deficiency.
Okay, how so?
Homosexuality as a distinct social and medical identity really emerged in the late 19th century. At the time, it was often seen as an inborn, irrepressible drive. As the philosopher Michel Foucault observed, the homosexual became a specific species, a defined category of person. This was fundamentally distinct from earlier sodomites, who were simply individuals engaging in certain behaviors without having a fixed, defining identity attached to them.
So the identity itself was a historical creation.
In many ways, yes. In Freud's era, male homosexuality was often characterized as effeminacy, and lesbianism as masculine affect. Both were considered these intractable products of early childhood experiences.
And perhaps not surprisingly, biological research claims during these periods often found what they hoped to find. Is that right?
That's what Kimmel suggests. They claimed, for example, that gay men's brains or hormone levels resembled females. For instance, in the 1970s, a researcher named Dorner claimed homosexual men have a predominantly female differentiated brain due to a supposed prenatal androgen deficiency.
Searching for a biological cause again.
Exactly. It's almost comical if it weren't so serious in its social implications when you hear about contemporary concerns like soy products will turn you gay.
Oh, I've heard that one.
Right. And this specific concern, strikingly, is exclusively for males, which itself illustrates a deeper gender inequality at play. Why wouldn't anyone worry about girls consuming soy products if homosexuality were truly about feminizing males? It's highly unlikely any food product turns someone gay. The underlying anxiety is clearly gendered.
That's a really good point. The fear itself reveals the gender bias.
What's truly insightful from Kimmel's perspective here is his argument that gender, rather than sexual orientation, is the primary organizing principle of sexual behavior.
Okay, unpack that a little.
He points out that gay men's sexuality often strikingly resembles straight men's sexuality, with the primary difference being the gender of their object choice. They often seek masculine sex as a confirmation of their own masculinity, which kind of reinforces traditional gender roles even within same-sex relationships.
Interesting. And for women?
Similarly, he argues, straight women and lesbians often experience feminine sex as a confirmation of their femininity. It makes you reevaluate how deeply gender influences even our most intimate desires and expressions.
So it's the performance of gender within the sexual act, regardless of orientation.
That's the argument. This raises an important question. How does this perspective challenge our common assumptions about what truly defines and drives sexual expression, regardless of who we're attracted to?
And this brings us to a fascinating conceptual distinction Kimmel explores. Gender polymorphism versus gender dimorphism.
Right, more fluid versus more rigid cultures.
Exactly. He discusses children born with ambiguous genital development, noting that for cultures that encounter this more frequently, maybe after several generations, they might come to understand that a girl doesn't always develop into a woman or a boy into a man in a fixed, linear way.
hmm Anthropologist Gilbert Hurt contrasts these gender polymorphic cultures. Think of them as societies that are really fluid, where someone might easily change their gender role or even identity across their life, not rigidly tied down to a single definition.
With gender dimorphic cultures, like the US, which are much more rigid, we expect everyone to fit neatly and permanently into either male or female from birth to death.
Right, two distinct boxes.
It's about how much wiggle room a culture gives you in expressing who you are. And it really makes you ask, who would choose to stay a girl if she could become a boy? Especially in a highly differentiated culture like ours, where males enjoy significant privileges that females often do not.
That highlights the social desirability of certain gender identities, doesn't it?
Hmm.
It's not just about internal feeling, but also external rewards.
Absolutely. Ultimately, Kimmel argues that sociology is uniquely equipped to understand what is truly different between women and men, what seems different, and most importantly, how gender difference is actually a product of, not a cause of, gender inequality.
That's a crucial reversal of common thinking.
It is, he puts it quite powerfully. We are gendered people living gendered lives in a gendered society. And it may be that only on this planet that such deeply ingrained, often rigid differences truly make a difference in the profound ways that they do.
It's a very sociological perspective. This overarching view truly sets the stage for our next deep dive, exploring how gender isn't just a personal identity, but is fundamentally constructed and reproduced within our most basic societal institutions.
And with that, yeah, let's transition into part 2 of our deep dive, gendered institutions and how they shape our lives from the ground up. Let's start with the gendered family, looking at everything from historical shifts to modern stressors.
Okay, it's a striking reality that in almost every society throughout history, labor has been divided by gender.
Seems universal almost.
It does. And one school of thought, functionalism, argues that this sex-based division of labor like men hunting, women gathering, or men working outside, women inside, was originally necessary for society's preservation. And therefore, its continuation is simply an evolutionary imperative.
So it suggests a certain inevitability to these roles, that they're natural.
Right. But anthropologist Eleanor Leacock offers a powerful alternative critique that really turns that functionalist view on its head. She argues that prior to the rise of private property and social classes, women and men often held different but equally esteemed positions. Women had an autonomous and public role that was complementary to men's, not secondary or subordinate.
So difference didn't necessarily mean inequality back then.
Exactly. She illustrates this with her ethnographic work on the Labrador Peninsula, showing how the introduction of the fur trade dramatically transformed women's autonomy among indigenous peoples there. It turned powerful women into homebound wives, whose labor was suddenly privatized and devalued.
Wow. So economic systems directly impacted gender roles and inequality.
Precisely. It connects economic systems and historical shifts directly to the introduction and solidification of gender inequality, rather than seeing it as some natural preordained state.
And speaking of fascinating connections, let's talk about male bonding and its surprising link to women's status.
Oh yeah. Daphne Spain's research here is really eye-opening. She uncovered a remarkable pattern. Cultures with the most elaborate male sex-segregated rituals were precisely those where women's status was lowest.
A direct correlation.
It seems so. She didn't just note it, she even mapped culture spatially. She found that the farther men's huts were from the village center, the more time men spent there, and the more culturally important men's rituals were, the lower women's status became.
That's incredible.
It is. As Spain powerfully concludes, societies with men's huts are those in which women have the least power. It makes a certain kind of sense, doesn't it? If men are spending all their time in these separate spaces, forging bonds exclusively with other men.
They'll have precious little time or inclination for family life or for engaging in shared power with women.
Exactly. This social pattern often extends to practices like male circumcision, which Kimmel points out is almost always a public ceremony. It simultaneously cements bonds between male generations, links males together in a shared experience, and explicitly excludes women often tied to beliefs about women being impure or less sacred. Other male genital mutilations, like ritual bleeding or even hemicastration, meaning the removal of one testicle in some cultures, are tragically linked to similar beliefs about women being infectious or impure, and male purity being tied to separation from the female realm.
That's quite extreme.
It is. Another powerful example is purdah, the Islamic requirement for women's concealment or veiling. Ostensibly, this is to protect women's chastity and men's honor because, as the men in these societies might say, women are so sexy, so tempting, so incapable of controlling their emotions and sexuality.
But that's only half the story, isn't it?
Right. As Kimmel astutely points out, it also suggests that men are so susceptible to temptation, so incapable of resistance, that they need to control women to protect themselves. It subtly shifts the burden of control from men's own behavior onto women's bodies.
That's a very insightful way to look at it. Now, when we turn our gaze to the evolution of the American family, it also tells a compelling and distinctly gendered story.
Definitely. Historian Gerda Lerner argues that the 19th century ideology of separate spheres, men in the public world of work, women in the private world of home, actually represented a historical decline in women's status.
A decline? How so?
Well, there were fewer female storekeepers and businesswomen in the 1830s compared to the 1780s. It meant women were effectively excluded from the new democracy and kind of imprisoned by domesticity.
But it wasn't just women suffering under this new paradigm, was it?
No, not entirely. Critics as early as the 1820s and 30s were complaining that men spent too little time at home. Paternal neglect was a major societal concern back then, too.
Really?
Yeah. Books like The Father's Book even emerged, explicitly written to persuade men to resume their family responsibilities. It highlights that even then, these gender roles weren't seen as natural by everyone. They had to be actively constructed and promoted.
Then, of course, came the romanticized 1950s ideal. The man in the gray flannel suit, the suburban breadwinner, women as devoted homemakers.
Right. And for many, Kimmel acknowledges, this family form did work well in some ways.
Yeah.
It provided a secure anchor, a sense of stability in what was an increasingly insecure corporate world.
Family life centered on kids, hobbies, vacations, the image of domestic bliss.
Exactly. Poet Archibald MacLeish's loving praise of his wife at the time perfectly encapsulates this ideal of companionship and stability within those defined gender roles.
But contemporary shifts are undeniable, and they've radically altered that 1950s ideal. Since the 1960s, the age of first marriage has significantly increased by 5 years for both women, now at 25.8, and men at 27.4.
People are marrying later.
Much later. And the number of children per couple has also steadily declined as more couples delay childbearing for education and careers. Today, consider this statistic. Only half of American children live in nuclear families with both birth parents.
Only half, yeah.
1/5 live in step families, and over 1/4 live in single-parent homes. These are the highest percentages among industrial nations. The traditional family is rapidly becoming less common.
Which brings us to a stark truth that Kimmel lays bare. Is marriage truly a better deal for men?
Ooh, provocative question.
Author Natalie Angier famously quipped, "Marriage is pretty good for the goose much of the time, but golden for the gander practically all of the time."
Meaning?
Meaning that, given the traditional division of labor, and even in non-traditional marriages where both partners work, husbands typically receive emotional, social, and sexual services from their wives. These wives, despite likely working outside the home, often receive precious few services in return. It highlights a fundamental imbalance that often persists.
And here's another surprising detail that kind of flies in the face of common assumptions. Children, paradoxically, tend to dampen marital bliss.
Really? You'd think kids would bring couples closer.
You would think. But childless couples, surprisingly, actually report higher levels of marital satisfaction. Happiness within a marriage often declines with the arrival of the first baby, then again when children reach school age, and yet again during the challenging teenage years.
That's counterintuitive.
It is. It's an interesting pattern. Husbands tend to report feeling better about their marriages once their children turn 18 and are more independent, but wives, tellingly, only report feeling better after their children leave home entirely.
Wow. That says a lot.
It does. It raises an important question. If children often lead to a dip in marital satisfaction, how does society frame the core purpose of family, and what implications does that have for the gendered expectations placed on parents, especially mothers?
This leads directly to a pivotal argument Kimmel makes. A chief, albeit often unacknowledged, purpose of the family is to maintain gender inequality and difference between parents, and then to impart these gendered identities to the next generation.
So the family itself reproduces gender norms.
That's the idea. It's where the seeds of gender difference are planted. Think about gender acquisition in children's play. Boys often acquire masculinity by actively avoiding anything feminine, almost like girliness is contagious or demeaning.
Right, don't be a sissy.
Exactly. Girls, on the other hand, tend to model their identities more directly on imitation of female roles they see. Boys role-play limitless mythic heroes, like cowboys or superheroes, embodying freedom and power. Girls, conversely, often role-play mothers, nurses, or teachers' roles, often bounded by concrete social constraints.
And while this has certainly changed somewhat in recent decades, particularly for girls, think soccer players, strong female video game characters,
Yeah, there's been progress for girls.
the shift towards nurturing or caring roles is far less pronounced for boys.
Right. This plays directly into the pervasive concept of the second shift and the persistent stress women experience, especially working mothers.
Ah, Arlie Hochschild's work.
Precisely. It's a fascinating paradox. Working mothers often report higher self-esteem and less depression than full-time housewives, which is positive. However, they report lower marital satisfaction than their husbands, who are generally happier.
Why the disparity?
Because, as Kimmel details, women's workload at home actually increases when they also enter the paid workforce. Meanwhile, men benefit from similar homework being done for them, plus an additional income that the wife brings in.
So women do two jobs, essentially.
Often, yes. And women consistently report higher stress levels in every industrial country. Hochschild coined the term second shift for the disproportionate amount of housework and childcare women perform despite working outside the home. She concluded that the revolution of women entering the workforce is stalled because men simply haven't reciprocated in the home.
And Hochschild's observations extend to how houses are often subtly or not so subtly divided into his and her zones, right?
Absolutely. His domain is typically outdoors, the yard, driveway, maybe indoor spaces like the basement and garage, often associated with maintenance or hobbies.
And hers.
Almost always indoors, the kitchen, laundry, bedrooms, bathroom, the spaces of daily domesticity and care. Studies show that while the total number of tasks listed by men and women might be roughly equivalent, the specific tasks differ dramatically.
Like men list wash the car, women list clean the toilet.
Pretty much. Men might list wash car, mow lawn. Women list cook meals, make beds, do laundry, clean bathrooms. It's an unequal distribution of daily, often invisible, labor.
And here's a kicker about men's housework participation. Researchers express significant doubt that men's domestic labor has increased much in the last, say, 25 years, largely due to significant overreporting by men themselves.
They say they do more than they actually do.
Apparently. When studies use accurate, objective records like time diaries, they consistently show husbands still do significantly less. About 14 hours of housework per week compared to wives' 31 hours.
That's less than half.
Yeah. And when both partners work full-time, the disparity shrinks slightly but remains substantial. The wife does 28 hours and the husband does 16.
Still a big gap. Just for comparison, Kimmel notes, in Sweden, men do about 2/3 of what Swedish women do in terms of housework, while in Japan, men do only 1/4 of Japanese women's housework. These are striking global differences.
And this deeply gender division of labor at home impacts the next generation, doesn't it?
It does. Daughters of working mothers tend to do more housework than sons, perpetuating the cycle. A recent study even found that one of the best predictors of men's participation in childcare was whether their own fathers were involved in housework and childcare.
So it's learned behavior passed down.
It seems strongly influenced by it. There's even a humorous example when Kimmel shares of male participation in housework fluctuating with football season,
Oh, no.
which, while maybe anecdotal, illustrates how deeply ingrained these priorities can be. This all makes you think about the provocative idea of a National Son Day, a concept parallel to Take Our Daughters to Work Day.
To teach boys housework.
Yeah, suggesting fathers should actively teach their sons housework, provided, of course, that the fathers themselves know how to do such things. So what does this ingrained pattern truly mean for the future of the family and for building genuinely equitable partnerships?
It's a huge question. Building on that, let's look at policy gaps and what Kimmel calls constructed problems. In the 1950s, the government actually actively supported family life by building critical infrastructure, schools, hospitals, roads, which made life easier for families.
Right, there was more collective support.
Exactly. Today, however, families are expected to do far more, like supporting adult children through college, navigating complex childcare arrangements, providing almost all of an adult's emotional needs, but with far less external support or infrastructure.
More pressure, less help.
Right. And this widening gap between expectation and support leads to what Kimmel terms constructed problems. Difficulties that aren't inherent to family life itself, but are rooted deeply in societal gender inequality and a lack of collective support.
A particularly poignant example is paternal withdrawal post-divorce. Research by McCoby and Mookin found that children living with mothers generally do as well as those living with fathers. The crucial factor wasn't the parent's gender, but effective household management and parental cooperation.
So quality of parenting matters most.
Yes. However, the troubling reality is that many fathers simply withdraw from their children's lives after divorce. Almost half of children living with mothers haven't seen their fathers in a year.
Half. That's shocking.
It is. And nearly half of all divorced U.S. fathers pay no child support, a stark contrast to about 1/4 in Europe. Many men, it seems, see parenting and marriage as a package deal, implicitly stopping being fathers once the marriage is over. This creates immense burdens, usually on single mothers.
And then there's the problem of gay and lesbian families, which Kimmel points out is profoundly ironic.
How so?
Those who fret most vocally about family decline and the breakdown of traditional family values are often the very people who actively prevent gay and lesbian individuals from forming families or deny their existing families legal recognition and protections.
So they create the problem they decry.
In a way, yes. The issues, he argues, are less about families themselves and more about the legal status and societal acceptance of homosexual individuals. For instance, after the Hawaii Supreme Court indicated it might recognize gay marriages in 1997, several states immediately rescinded adherence to the full faith and credit clause of the Constitution, and Congress swiftly passed the Defense of Marriage Act, DOMA, to explicitly define marriage as between one man and one woman.
Right, the legal barriers.
And legal adoption for gay people is still limited to only 10 states in D.C., highlighting significant remaining barriers. Children of same-sex couples are also, on average, more racially and ethnically diverse and often have fewer economic resources, partly due to these systemic discriminations.
But here's the crucial finding, directly from extensive research, that really debunks these fears. None of the widespread anxieties about gay parenting have materialized.
What does the research actually show?
There's no evidence whatsoever that gay fathers or lesbian mothers negatively influence child development or are more likely to sexually abuse children. In fact, studies consistently show that outcomes for children in these families tend to be better than average.
Better than average.
Yes. The quality of mothering, or indeed parenting generally, meaning factors like warmth, consistency, emotional responsiveness, not sexual orientation, is the crucial determinant of children's healthy development.
So the fears are unfounded by evidence.
Completely, which raises an important question. Why do societal fears and restrictive policy actions persist so strongly when the evidence so clearly suggests otherwise? What are those fears truly about?
That's a deep question. Let's pivot now and turn our attention to the gendered classroom, another institution where gender is deeply etched.
Okay, that's cool.
The popular interplanetary theory of gender tells us that boys and girls are just fundamentally different from birth. Boys excel in science math, are rambunctious shout-out answers. Girls are quiet, verbally adept, excel in French and literature.
Stereotypes we all know.
Exactly. Yet these supposedly fundamentally different creatures sit in the same classrooms, read the same books, have the same teachers, but are they truly having the same experience?
Kimmel would argue, not exactly. Gendered messages and expectations begin even before school. Everything from who sits where to who is called on in class to how different behaviors are interpreted is, in fact, subtly but powerfully gendered.
Even children's books and media, while showing some positive shifts, often continue to reinforce these stereotypes, right?
Yeah, girls are more often main characters now and less passively waiting to be rescued, which is good.
Progress there.
But they're still frequently depicted as more interested in domestic life or relationships. Critically, there's been no comparable shift for boys towards nurturing or caring roles. Men in storybooks often still have enormous trouble coming back home or engaging in domestic life.
This also ties into the contentious war against boys argument, doesn't it? The claim that boys are the new victims of discrimination in schools.
Right. Proponents like Christina Hoff Sommers argue schools are run by women for girls, that they're pathologizing boyhood by expecting quiet behavior from naturally restless, impulsive boys.
They argue the focus on girls has ignored boys' needs.
Essentially, yes. They contend that the increased focus on girls' needs and achievements has inadvertently ignored boys' distinct learning styles and physical needs.
And it gets even more complex when we look at gender and salary in education, echoing patterns we see across many professions.
The pay gap in female-dominated fields.
Exactly. It's almost axiomatic. The greater the proportion of women in a field, the lower the salary attached to it. For example, back in 1980, female pre-kindergarten teachers, who are 98% women, earn significantly less than their male counterparts.
Big difference.
Huge. $8,390 versus $14,912. And similar discrepancies persist today. These salary gaps tend to increase with experience, partly because women often take more time off for childbearing and rearing, which impacts their career progression and lifetime earnings.
So the structure penalizes caregiving roles, which women disproportionately take on.
That seems to be a major factor. This unfortunate reality feeds into the debate about sex segregation in education, where institutions like military academies, the Citadel, VMI, have historically cited supposed gender differences to justify excluding women.
Using difference to justify exclusion.
Right. However, John Dewey, a fierce supporter of women's equal rights and a great theorist of education, scoffed at ideas like female botany or female algebra way back in 1911.
What does he say?
He rightly called them dogmatic assertion based on so little scientific evidence. Dewey powerfully argued that coeducation is actually beneficial for women, opening opportunities and helping them become less manipulative and more self-reliant by engaging with a broader range of ideas and individuals.
Interesting. So diversity in the classroom benefits everyone.
That was his view. Let's shift our perspective now and explore the profound gendering of religion.
Okay, a big one.
Historically, pre-modern societies often had powerful goddesses, especially for fertility, harvests, creation.
Right, the divine feminine was much more prominent.
Exactly. Some anthropologists even suggest that primitive matriarchies in polytheistic cultures were gradually replaced by conquest or contact with more patriarchal societies. Marisha Gimbutas, for example, famously argued that Neolithic Europe was this peaceful, goddess-oriented civilization
That was utterly destroyed by weapon-wielding patriarchal horsemen sweeping across Europe from the east. It's a compelling, if maybe debated, narrative of how power shifts can reshape our spiritual landscape.
In contrast to these ancient traditions, most mainstream monotheistic religions today often explicitly proclaim divinely inspired gender difference, which then serves to legitimize and reinforce inequality.
The examples are pretty stark, aren't they?
They are. The Orthodox Jew who daily thanks God he wasn't born a woman. The Catholic Church is unwavering and declared infallible opposition to women's ordination into the priesthood, because priests, they claim, must physically resemble Jesus.
The Quran stating men are in charge of women, the ancient Hindu code of Manu declaring that a woman must never be free of subjugation.
It makes you ask, where are the women in positions of spiritual power and authority within these major traditions? Only about 5% of Black church pastors are female, for instance, reflecting a broader pattern of exclusion.
And this leads to a particularly striking phenomenon that Kimmel observes: the masculinization of Jesus and God, especially when women's equality begins to rise.
How does that work?
Evangelists like Billy Sunday in the early 20th century famously celebrated Jesus as a he-man, criticizing mainstream ministers as mental perverts and intellectuals as fudge-eating mollycoddles.
Wow, strong language.
Very. He thundered against flabby-cheeked, brittle-boned, weak-kneed, thin-skinned, pliable, plastic, spineless, effeminate, ossified three-carat Christianity. He famously asked, "Don't tell me about the peaceful, gentle Jesus. Jesus Christ could go like a six-cylinder engine."
So, a very muscular Christianity.
Exactly. Kimmel's insight here is powerful. A revirilized Jesus, or a more explicitly masculine God, may become necessary to reestablish a divinely ordained hierarchy, especially by those who feel threatened by women's equality.
So, as women gain equality, God gets tougher in some interpretations.
It suggests that the more equal women become in society, the more fiercely masculine God becomes in the eyes of his earthly stewards, almost as if to compensate for the perceived loss of male dominance.
Countering this trend, though, there's been a significant and growing movement towards woman-centered spirituality.
Right. Feminist-inspired challenges cite alternative religious texts or offer reinterpretations of existing ones to find a more inclusive divine feminine.
And historically, female-dominated Protestant sects like the Shakers and Christian Science emerged, offering spiritual paths that diverge from patriarchal norms.
Theologian Leonard Swidler argued in the 1970s that Jesus, far from being a proponent of gender hierarchy, was actually a feminist who vigorously promoted the dignity and equality of women, reinterpreting scripture through a new lens.
And the groundbreaking feminist author Charlotte Perkins Gilman argued profoundly that religion, our greatest help in conscious progress, has been injured by coming through the minds of men alone.
That's a powerful statement.
She believed this wasn't necessarily deliberate male fault, but rather an inevitable byproduct of the great tragedy of our species, the subjugation of the female. She detailed the calamitous consequences of making a private servant of the mother of the race, highlighting how deeply gendered power dynamics have shaped even our spiritual understandings.
It really makes you think about whose perspective shapes our view of the divine.
Absolutely. Let's shift gears now to the gendered workplace, an arena where traditional gender roles have been both challenged and stubbornly maintained.
Okay, work life.
Work is undeniably crucial for men's identity, for proving their manhood, yet it doesn't necessarily make them happy. That's a key paradox Kimmel explores.
Right. Psychiatrist Willard Galen once remarked, "I have never met a man who in his heart of hearts considers himself a success."
That's quite a statement.
It is. And a 1974 Yankelovich survey found that a staggering 80% of American men were unhappy in their jobs. In fact, 74% said they would choose a slower career path if it meant more family time.
So the drive for success doesn't equal happiness.
It seems not. The familiar cliché truly holds here. No man on his deathbed ever said he wished he had spent less time with his family and more time at the office. It points to a deep disconnect between societal expectations of masculinity and individual well-being.
Despite the sweeping changes in society and the workforce, traditional gender ideologies persist with remarkable tenacity. And often, the idealized 1950s gender arrangement wasn't even the reality of the 1950s itself.
Right. Consider a show like Mad Men. It brilliantly depicts the early 1960s with a perfectly gender-segregated world. All male executives, all female secretaries, and incidentally, all white. Male entitlement and sexual predation were simply just how things are, ingrained norms of that era. Contemporary viewers often feel a sense of self-congratulation about the progress we've made since then, but it serves as a powerful reminder of how deeply ingrained and normalized these systems of gender segregation and power once were.
And there's been a significant squeeze on men's incomes that contributes to this anxiety about their provider role.
Yeah, the economic pressures.
When adjusted for inflation, median family income in the United States since 1973 has remained relatively flat. But that's despite the fact that more women have entered the workforce, often creating dual-income households.
So family income is flat even with more workers.
Exactly. Which means that men's individual incomes, when adjusted for inflation, have actually declined. Consider this stark data. A 30-year-old man in 1973 would see his real income fall by 1% by age 40. Compare that to a 63% rise for a 30-year-old man back in 1949.
Wow, a huge difference. Falling income for men over that period?
Yeah. This increased economic pressure and the constant threat of precarity from downsizing and layoffs make American men deeply anxious about their traditional provider role. In fact, men accounted for over 4 out of every 5 jobs lost since the 2008 recession, highlighting their vulnerability in a changing economy.
And alongside these economic shifts, gender discrimination remains a chief and persistent obstacle in the workplace.
How does Kimmel define discrimination here?
He defines it in 2 primary ways. When similar people are treated differently, like excluding qualified women or minorities from jobs, or, conversely, when different people are treated similarly, like failing to provide wheelchair access for disabled individuals, treating them the same as able-bodied people when they need different accommodations.
Got it.
And the persistence of sex segregation in professions worldwide is incredibly telling. If it were simply about socialized differences or individual preferences, professions would have comparable gender distributions globally. But they demonstrably don't.
Give us some examples.
Okay. In New York City, a minuscule 0.03% of firefighters are women, compared to a significant 17% in Minneapolis. In the U.S., dentistry is overwhelmingly male-dominated, but in many parts of Europe, most dentists are female. In Russia, about half of all doctors are women.
So huge variations by country.
Exactly. This stark divergence strongly suggests systemic discrimination and entrenched cultural norms at play, not merely individual choice or inherent difference.
And then, of course, there's the pervasive gender wage gap. While some argue it's a myth or a feminist fiction, trying to explain it away with differences in education, experience, or motivation.
The data tells a different story.
It does. U.S. Census figures consistently demonstrate a clear and persistent wage gap across all racial and ethnic groups. Women, on average, continue to earn significantly less than men for comparable work, even when controlling for many of those other factors.
Which leads us to the contrasting, yet equally illuminating concepts of the glass ceiling and the glass escalator.
Okay, explain those.
The glass ceiling refers to the invisible, yet very real obstacles women face in hiring, promotion, and retention, particularly in reaching leadership positions. Some companies, like Reebok, Bank of Montreal, Lotus, have implemented diversity programs to combat this, showing some success, but the ceiling persists.
So barriers stopping women going up. What about the glass escalator?
That's a term coined by sociologist Christine Williams, and it offers a stark contrast. Men entering female-dominated occupations, like nursing, librarianship, elementary education, social work, often experience a form of positive discrimination.
They get a boost.
It seems so. They are, perhaps unexpectedly, often hired preferentially and promoted to managerial positions more rapidly and frequently than women in the same occupations. They earn more and are promoted faster than women doing the very same work.
Wow. So a ceiling for women, an escalator for men, even in women's fields.
Exactly. What's truly fascinating here is the stark asymmetry.
Sexual harassment is another powerful and insidious mechanism by which men subtly or sometimes overtly resist gender equality in the workplace.
Yeah, unfortunately still very relevant.
Mm.
Its increased visibility in recent decades is fueled by more robust reporting, the relabeling of behaviors men once took for granted as acceptable, and crucially, greater legal accountability.
There was a key legal development, wasn't there?
Yes. Feminist lawyer Catherine McKinnon famously argued that sexual harassment violates Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act because it fundamentally discriminates based on sex and creates a hostile work environment. By 1982, the U.S. Court of Appeals definitively declared it unlawful, a landmark legal victory.
And the impact of sexual harassment is severe, right?
Absolutely. Harassed women consistently report a range of psychological and physical effects. Chronic stress, irritability, eating and sleeping disorders, increased absenteeism from work, profound feelings of humiliation and helplessness. Some even describe the experience as psychological rape.
Where does it tend to happen most?
Kimmel notes it occurs most frequently in recently integrated workplaces, places like surgical operating theaters, firefighting, investment banking, where women are new to the environment and often a numerical minority. As Dr. Louise Fitzgerald vividly puts it, men see women as invading a masculine environment. They're trying to scare women off a male preserve, revealing the underlying power dynamics.
This brings us to comparable worth programs. What are those?
Kimmel argues they're essential due to the intimate link between sex segregation in occupations and pervasive wage inequality. The idea is to evaluate jobs based on skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions, and pay comparable wages for jobs of comparable value, regardless of whether they are traditionally male or female jobs.
Sounds logical. Why is there opposition?
Opposition often arises from deeply flawed misperceptions, like the claim it's impossible to determine worth for different jobs, despite two-thirds of companies already using job evaluations, or that it interferes with the labor market, as if the market, not bureaucratic decisions and gender stereotypes, actually sets wages, or the dire prediction that it would bankrupt employers.
What are the counter-arguments?
Strong ones. Firms can and should set wages by skill and responsibility, not by the sex of the worker. And beyond fairness, women earning more would actually increase consumer purchasing power, benefiting the entire economy.
Sociologist Karen Oppenheim-Mason powerfully states that workplace inequality will persist unless major revisions occur in our ideology of gender and the division of labor between the sexes.
Yeah, she argues job segregation is simply part of the broader pattern of separate and unequal lives that women and men lead. Unless the overall separateness in how we conceive of and organize gender roles fundamentally changes, she argues, it won't genuinely end in the occupational system either.
Finally, within the workplace, there's the enduring and frustrating challenge of balancing work and family life, a struggle that often disproportionately impacts women.
The work-life juggle.
Right. Tony Blair's choice to take only 2 days of parental leave after his son's birth, despite more generous policies existing, highlights both structural problems and deeply ingrained attitudinal barriers.
Policies might exist on paper, but the culture doesn't support using them.
Exactly. Workers, especially men, often don't use them. Men fear being seen as less committed to their careers, or even worse, having their masculinity threatened if they prioritize family leave. Women, on the other hand, fear being forever labeled as mommies instead of dedicated employees.
The mommy track or daddy track fear.
Both fear it, and it can derail career progression. Young fathers, in particular, often need significant career security and a supportive workplace culture before they feel comfortable asking for flexibility, as it's so often perceived as a lack of commitment.
Which raises that important question again. How can we truly create environments where both men and women feel genuinely empowered to balance their work and family commitments without fear of penalty, without having to choose between career success and family engagement?
It's a critical, ongoing question, and it leads us nicely into our final section, gendered intimacies, exploring how gender profoundly shapes our relationships and our very bodies.
Okay, moving into the personal realm.
Let's start with something as fundamental as friendship. Historically, some arguments, like those from Robert Lewis and Lionel Tiger, suggested that male friendships were inherently deeper and more durable than women's.
Right, the hunting warfare bonding argument.
Exactly. This was often attributed to supposed evolutionary necessities, seeing male bonding as a biologically based human adaptation. Women's friendships, though maybe pleasant, weren't seen as necessary in the same evolutionary sense.
But the 20th century saw a dramatic transformation in how we view gender and friendship, didn't it?
It really did. Feminism began to celebrate women's intimacy and emotional expressiveness as a true asset, a vital source of solidarity and strength.
And simultaneously, the men's liberation movement emerged, advocating for men to embrace emotional intimacy, valuing virtues often traditionally associated with women, like nurture and open self-disclosure.
So, do men and women express intimacy differently in friendships?
Research suggests yes, though both desire intimacy. Meta Caldwell and Letitia Piplau found both men and women have similar numbers of friends and spend similar time with them. However, men were twice as likely to prefer doing some activity with friends, focusing on shared experiences.
Shoulder-to-shoulder intimacy.
Kind of. Women, conversely, were more likely to choose friends who feels the same way about things and tend to prefer just talking, valuing verbal connection and emotional resonance. Sociologist Beth Hess even found women were twice as likely to talk about deeply personal issues with friends.
Now, here's a truly surprising shift that emerged around the year 2000. What was that?
By 2007-2008, a slight majority of both women and men, 54%, actually said that men make better friends.
Both men and women said that. Why?
The reasons they gave were incredibly telling. Guys don't judge you, you can relax, and girls always want you to talk about your feelings. It suggests a fascinating reevaluation of what constitutes a good friend, one that transcends traditional gender expectations and highlights a hunger for non-judgmental, relaxed connection.
That is surprising. And it's not just about broad gender differences. Class and race also significantly shape male friendships.
Absolutely. Working-class black male friendships, for example, are often highly self-disclosing and exceptionally close, partly due to a shared political ideology and collective experiences. However, upwardly mobile black men tend to report having fewer and less intimate friends, perhaps because they've more readily accepted traditional, less emotionally expressive definitions of masculinity often associated with corporate success. Sociologist Shanette Harris suggests that while strategies adopted for African-American male empowerment and survival, like strong group solidarity, can be powerful, they can sometimes be maladaptive if they reinforce narrow, dominating definitions of masculinity. She emphasizes the vital need to redefine masculinity to exclude themes of domination and superiority.
A huge, often unspoken factor profoundly impacting male friendships is homophobia.
Yes, this is crucial. Because emotional disclosure often feels like vulnerability and dependency feelings, typically linked to sexual relationships with women in our culture. Most men report being less comfortable disclosing their true feelings to male friends than to female friends.
It's the fear of being seen as gay.
It's not just an irrational fear of gay people, but the profound fear of being misperceived as gay oneself or having one's masculinity questioned. That fear acts as a central organizing principle of same-sex male friendships. This fear is virtually non-existent for women in their friendships.
Wow. That raises an important, even unsettling question. What does this widespread, often unconscious power of social norms and ingrained homophobia tell us about the pervasive influence on our closest relationships, shaping how we connect or fail to connect with other men?
Yet, cross-cultural examples beautifully illustrate that these patterns are not universal. Different possibilities for male intimacy exist.
Like where?
Anthropologist Robert Brain documents societies in Africa, South America, and Oceania where men, despite rigorous ritual separation from their mothers and the female world, actually develop incredibly deep emotional lives and more intimate friendships than women in those cultures. They ritually bind themselves together as lifetime comrades, blood brothers, or even symbolic spouses.
So it is possible for men to have deep, intimate, non-sexual bonds.
Absolutely. This powerful example challenges our assumptions and proves that the patterns we see in Western male friendships are products of social construction, not inherent biological destiny.
Let's turn our attention now to love and sexuality, where we observe both converging desires and persistent, often troublesome differences.
Okay.
It's fascinating to trace the evolution of love in marriage. In 19th century marriage manuals, love was rarely even mentioned as a primary reason for marriage.
Really? What was the reason then?
Practicality, stability, family alliance. Love was often seen more as a product of marriage itself, something that might grow over time rather than the reason to get married.
But that changed.
Dramatically. By the end of that century, as social structures shifted, love became the most important prerequisite to marriage for the emerging middle class, fundamentally altering the very purpose and expectation of marital unions.
Our pervasive gendered body anxieties also tell a powerful story about societal pressures. For women, concerns often revolve disproportionately around breast size and weight.
Yeah, the pressure's immense.
The stark contrast between the average runway model, 5'11", 117 pounds, typically a size 2, and the average American woman, 5'4", 162.9 pounds, about a size 14, highlights an unattainable media-driven ideal that causes immense distress.
Mary Pfeiffer wrote about this, didn't she?
Yes, the psychologist. She notes that girls are terrified of being fat, with a disturbing 42% of first third graders wanting to be thinner and 81% of 10-year-olds already afraid of being fat.
That young. That's heartbreaking.
It is. For men, anxieties mirror women's, but focus intensely on muscularity, leading to what's been termed muscle dysmorphia, or the Adonis complex, a feeling of being perpetually too small or needing to look like Greek gods.
So men feel pressure to bone up.
Increasingly so. The growing media display of men's bodies and pervasive economic anxiety contribute to this shift in male body image concerns. The key insight here, Kimmel suggests, is that as women and men become more equal in the public sphere, beauty standards often seem to emphasize those aspects that are biologically different, almost as if to reinforce traditional distinctions where social ones are blurring.
Interesting. And transgenderism in its very existence offers living, undeniable proof of the social construction of gender, right? And the profound distinction between biological sex and social gender.
Absolutely. Transgender people feel their biological sex, the one they were assigned at birth, doesn't match their internal gender identity. They often describe themselves as trapped in the wrong body.
They bravely undergo therapy, hormone treatments, sometimes sex reassignment surgery, SRS, to align their physical bodies with their felt gender identity.
Which is a central point in Kimmel's argument. Transgender individuals provide living proof that the social construction of gender and sexuality is more than simply metaphoric. They embody the idea that gender is a deeply personal, internal sense that can be distinct from physical attributes, fundamentally challenging simplistic biological determinism.
When we look at sexualities, Kimmel reveals a persistent divide between women often prioritizing emotional connection and men sometimes seeking more hassle-free pleasure.
Right. Women's sexuality, he observes, often requires a deeper emotional connection to be truly satisfying. As one woman told sociologist Lillian Rubin, "For sex to really work for me, I need to feel an emotional something. Without that, it's just another athletic activity, only not as satisfying."
And this is reinforced by the finding that women's first sexual experiences typically occur within committed, emotionally significant relationships.
On the other hand, pornography, Kimmel argues, tells lies men really want to hear, primarily the fantasy that every woman really, secretly, deep down, wants to have sex with you.
He suggests it's often a revenge fantasy for men who feel they don't get enough sex in their own lives.
That's his interpretation. It offers hassle-free vicarious sex where, crucially, no one ever says no, creating an unreal expectation that can distort real-world interactions.
Despite these differences, there is a clear trend toward adult sexual convergence, isn't there?
Yes, definitely. Rates of premarital sex and the number of partners are converging for both men and women. Interestingly, surveys from the 1970s and 80s showed married women having greater sexual activity and variety than previously imagined. And today, both men and women express a desire for frequent sex and report being happier when they feel empowered to initiate and refuse equally.
What about the current popular panic over the dramatic increase in oral sex among teenagers?
Right, over half of 15, 19-year-olds engaging in it, 70% by age 19. Kimmel suggests this indicates both this gender convergence in sexual behaviors and, simultaneously, persistent inequality, often focusing on male pleasure without equal reciprocation.
While evolutionary psychology might suggest men are hardwired to seek immediate pleasure and women romantic connection, Kimmel explores the nuance.
Yeah, he notes that non-relational sex, while recently viewed by society as problematic, can actually be a positive experience for adolescents in some contexts, reducing tension, gaining experience.
Ugh.
The ideal goal, he suggests, isn't judgment, but to enlarge sexual repertoires for both women and men, allowing for a wide variety of expressions of love and lust.
As long as they are mutually negotiated, safe, and equal.
Exactly. It's about expanding possibilities responsibly, not limiting them based on old scripts.
AIDS, tragically, is identified by Kimmel as a highly gendered disease in U.S. history, disproportionately affecting one gender initially.
Yeah, he points out that masculinity, often defined by risk-taking, avoidance of responsibility for one's actions or others' well-being, and the pursuit of sex above other ends, is a significant risk factor in the spread of AIDS.
That's a sobering thought, drawing a parallel to how the same masculine traits might also be risk factors in behaviors like drunk driving accidents.
And this spills over into other behaviors, like binge drinking, particularly among young women. Studies show that a striking 80% of women in sororities are binge drinkers, compared to 30% outside.
80%? Why so high?
Some young women interpret drinking like a guy as a badge of honor or even a feminism thing, seeing it as a sign of power and liberation.
But as the incisive journalist Barbara Ehrenreich critically noted,
Right, she said, gender equality wouldn't be worth fighting for if all it meant was the opportunity to be as stupid and self-destructive as men can be.
ouch. But it raises an important question. What is the true measure of liberation if it merely mimics potentially harmful existing norms, rather than forging new, healthier paths?
A crucial question indeed.
Finally, let's address the undeniable gender of violence. Violence is almost universally across cultures and history strongly associated with masculinity.
It's a very strong link. Explanations for male violence range from biological ones like the correlation between androgens, testosterone, and aggression, where increased testosterone often means increased aggression, to evolutionary explanations like homosocial competition, where men are theorized to fight for dominance hierarchies to secure sexual access to females.
Theories trying to root violence in fundamental innate drives.
Right. And this powerful association of violence with masculinity extends into political leadership and warfare. War and its technology, as Simone de Beauvoir observed, often confer virile prestige.
Historical figures like Andrew Jackson, known for brutality, or Theodore Roosevelt charging up San Juan Hill, embody this ideal of the strenuous life.
Exactly. Military prowess and a perceived willingness to go to war have historically been, and continue to be, seen as fundamental tests of manhood for leaders. As a biographer noted, Lyndon Johnson reportedly escalated the Vietnam War, in part to prove his masculinity.
Showing how deeply these gendered expectations can influence decisions with global consequences.
Absolutely. And beneath all this lies the insidious specter of the sissy. There's a pervasive societal fear that boys who are not aggressive or violent, who don't conform to traditional tough guy stereotypes, won't grow up to be real men.
The fear of being seen as weak or feminine?
Precisely. The profound fear of emasculation, humiliation, and effeminacy drives a significant amount of masculine violence as men lash out to prove their manhood. Psychiatrist James Gilligan speaks compellingly of patriarchal code of honor and shame which generates and obligates male violence, seeing violence as the chief demarcating line between women and men, a constant performance to uphold a precarious identity.
This brings us to the profoundly gendered crime of rape. Kimmel argues powerfully that rape is less about isolated, sick individuals and far more a systemic problem rooted in societal expectations of male behavior.
Stemming directly from gender inequality and a deep, culturally reinforced disrespect and contempt for women. It exists on a continuum, from subtle sexual coercion to the premeditated use of alcohol or drugs to dissolve a woman's resistance and consent.
And the studies are alarming, challenging the sick individual argument.
They really are. Mary Koss's research found that 1 in 13 college men admitted to forcing or attempting to force sex. Scott Boringer found that over 55% of male students engaged in some form of sexual coercion, with a significant percentage attempting rape, or facilitating non-consensual sex with drugs or alcohol.
These numbers unequivocally underscore that rape is a widespread social problem driven by gendered power dynamics, not just the isolated acts of a few deviant individuals.
Exactly.
So, as we wrap up this extensive deep dive, we've explored just how deeply intertwined gender is with our social structures, our fundamental institutions, and our most intimate personal lives.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey through Kimmel's work.
We've seen that what we often perceive as natural differences between men and women are in fact frequently the products of a gendered society rather than their inherent cause. It's a profound shift in perspective.
It really is. This brings us to a core challenge that Kimmel puts forth,
Mm.
the idea of androgyny versus genuine equality. Androgyny, often conceived as the complete elimination of differences between genders, where equality means sameness, remains largely unpopular. It's often viewed as coercive, maybe a bland, tasteless amalgam, where individuals lose their distinctiveness.
So the core question becomes, is the only way for women and men to be equal to become the same?
Or can we not imagine a profound and meaningful equality that is based, instead, on respect for and the enthusiastic embracing of genuine, diverse differences, where those differences are not ranked or tied to power?
And here's where we find signs of hope and a clear path forward, according to Kimmel. The historical evidence itself points powerfully to the possibility of genuine systemic change.
Yeah, so.
That separation of spheres, which enforced distinct realms and traits for men and women, was actually a historical aberration, not some natural state of being. It had to be coercively imposed and rigorously policed.
Which ironically goes a long way in explaining the very vehemence with which it was done, because nothing truly natural needs such force to be maintained.
Exactly. Kimmel offers a truly powerful vision for future generations. If both mothers and fathers are equally loving, caring, and nurturing toward their children,
Then children will internalize a new, healthier understanding that grown-ups do nurture, not just mothers. This shifts the fundamental landscape of what it means to be an adult and what it means to be a man or a woman.
sociology, as Kimmel consistently emphasizes, is uniquely able to understand what is truly different between us and what merely seems to be different.
And crucially, to show how those perceived differences are often the result of inequality rather than its cause. We truly do live on a planet where these differences, constructed as they are, make a profound difference in our lives, shaping our opportunities, our relationships, our very sense of self.
Kimmel's monumental work ultimately explores how we can achieve more fulfilling and equitable lives, both in and outside the workplace, by directly addressing and dismantling gender inequality.
Yeah, it's a call for change, really.
It is. So, as we close this deep dive, consider this final provocative thought. If masculinity, often defined by risk-taking, an avoidance of responsibility, and the pursuit of sex above all other ends, is identified by researchers as a significant risk factor for a global health crisis like AIDS, what other pressing societal issues might be significantly ameliorated or even solved if we collectively redefined our understanding of masculinity and femininity to embrace true equality, shared responsibility, and a richer, more diverse spectrum of human experience?
That's something truly worth mulling over long after this deep dive ends.